Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kinaser and you're watching Installing System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 Service Pack 1. I am telling you, if you like the last lesson, this is going to be ultra cool. Again, not a lot of PowerPoint, a lot of hands-on, and we're actually going to get to install Virtual Machine Manager. So it's starting to get really cool. We're starting to build these blocks that are getting us one step closer to a Microsoft private cloud. But before we get into the GUI and before we start making installations and configurations on our servers, let's take a look at what are the hardware requirements and software requirements that we're going to need during this lesson. So there are two components that you need to be aware of. There is the server manager component, so the virtual machine manager server, and there's also the console requirements. Now we are going to install the virtual machine manager server component on a dedicated new server that I have created. And the minimum requirements, the minimum hardware requirements for this server are an Intel Pentium 4 2 GHz processor. Now this is the minimum requirement. Typically you're going to want to go higher. Probably most of your hardware is going to come with higher processing capabilities anyway. And depending on how many hosts you intend on managing, so if you're trying to manage probably more than 50 hosts, let's say, with this virtual machine manager server, then you probably want to go to a higher processor, maybe even a dual core or a quad core or an 8-way or whatever processor you have today. From a RAM perspective, the 2 GB is a minimum, 4 GB is recommended. What I'm using in my lab again is 4 GB for this particular management server. I'm also using a server that has 4 processors, just so you guys know. And since it's a virtual machine, I'm using 4 virtual CPUs or 1 CPU and 4 cores, depending on what hypervisor you're trying to use. From a hard disk requirements perspective, 80 gig is the minimum, 150 gig is recommended. For the purposes of our demonstration, we're going to go with 80 gig. We're not going to be filling that up, but for your purposes, you're probably going to go with 150 gig, maybe even higher, maybe have multiple partitions as well for better performance, especially if you have a local SQL server installed on there. Now this is from a hardware requirements perspective for the Virtual Machine Manager server. Now let's take a look at the software requirements. So you can install System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 Service Pack 1 on a server that's running Windows Server 2008 R2 or higher. I am installing it on a Windows Server 2012. You want to make sure that the Windows Remote Management WinRM service is enabled. If you're using Windows Server 2012, that's going to be enabled by default. You're going to want to make sure that the Microsoft.NET Framework 4.0 or higher is enabled and installed. Again, if you're using Windows Server 2012, that's going to be enabled by default. You're going to want to install the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit, otherwise known as ADK for Windows 8. Now there are two features as you're installing it, and I'll show you when we get into the demo. Two features that we're going to need there, the deployment tools and the Windows Pre-Installation Environment or Windows PE. You're going to need a copy of SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 or higher. That's the minimum requirement. In my environment, I'm using SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 2. So just, if you're trying to follow along, that's what I'm using in my environment. Now, if you're going to do that for SQL Server 2008 R2 and for the Windows Assessment and Deployment Kit as well, you're going to want to install and enable the Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1. Which will automatically enable .NET Framework 2.0 and 3.0 functionality. So this is from a software requirement as far as the Virtual Machine Manager server is concerned. That's it. This is the slideware for this lesson. Are you guys ready? Because we're going to rock this lesson. Let's go ahead and jump into our Virtual Machine Manager server and let's start configuring and installing System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 Service Pack 1. Alright, so we're on the VMM server, VMM01, and I've done a few preparatory steps. So I've already installed SQL Server 2008 R2 and updated to Service Pack 2. So if you want to follow along, this would be a good time to pause the video. Go ahead and install SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 2 so that you're at the same level as I am in my lab. And in order to do that, I also want to show you what I've done on the server, just so we're on the same page. So if I bring up Server Manager here and we go into local settings or local server, let's take a look real quick at what I've done. So I've disabled the Internet Explorer Enhanced Security. So if you have that turned on, you can turn it off if you like. You want to make sure that your remote management is enabled. If that's disabled, again, click on it here and essentially turn it on. Very simple, very straightforward. You might want to turn off the firewall or keep it on and customize it and configure it. That's really up to you. I have it turned on for the moment. We might turn it off at a later time, but for now it's turned on. I've also installed the .NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1, which will include the prerequisites for SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 and some other features that we're going to install later on. So you'll see that this is installed here and it covers 2.0 and 3.0. So these are some of the preparatory steps that I've done on this server ahead of the beginning of the installation of some of the components that we need for Virtual Machine Manager 2012 Service Pack 1. So now that I have these installed, the first thing that we want to install is actually the assessment and deployment kit. So I've already downloaded that from Microsoft and I've put it into my downloads directory here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply just double click on it. And click on Run. I'm going to accept all the defaults. I'm not going to change any of the locations here. Click on Next. I do not want to participate in the customer experience at this point. Next. We're going to accept the EULA. And the only two things that you have to worry about here, the only two things that you want to really install are going to be the deployment tools and the Windows pre-installation environment or Windows PE. So those are the two components that you really want. Once you've disabled or unchecked the rest, we're going to click on Install and the installation process is just going to take off. Now this will take a few minutes to complete, but once done we can then run the System Center 2012 Virtual Machine Manager setup. Alright, once that's complete, you can feel free to launch the Getting Started guide if you choose to do so. We don't need to do this at this point, so I'm just going to click on Close. We have satisfied all of the prerequisites for the installation of System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 Service Pack 1, so we're ready to get started with the installation. I've already downloaded the files and I've extracted them into this directory, so I'm going to go ahead and double click on Setup. And we're going to go ahead and click on Install. The installation is very straightforward. For the most part, we're going to accept all of the defaults. Which components do we want to install? We want to install the management server, which is automatically going to also install the console on the server. Now keep in mind, while we're installing the console on the server, best practice as an administrator dictates that you install all of your management consoles on a management PC, which is what we're going to do also at the same time. So keep in mind, while we're installing the console because we need some of its prerequisites and so that it's there on the server, I urge you to have a management PC that you're consolidating all of your management console on and where you're doing all of your management from, so that you're not RDPing to the different servers and using centralized managed consoles. So I'm going to make those selections. We're going to click on Next to get started. Over here, I'm just going to put in my name. And we are going to put in Wired Brain Coffee. We're going to accept the EULA. We do not wish to participate in the customer experience at this point. I'm going to turn Windows Updates on so that we're getting Windows Updates for Virtual Machine Manager through Windows Update. Now again, depending on what you have configured within your environment, within your enterprise, what are the standards, what are the processes that you have, you might choose to turn this off or on. I'm going to do on for now. We're going to click on Next. This is the default location where it's going to be installed. I'm not changing it, so we're going to push forward with Next. Now while there's a pending restart, I'm going to go ahead and ignore this for now. We'll restart the server in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And at this point, it's prompting us to configure the database. Now remember, I have SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 2 installed on this server. So what I'm going to do at this point is use my local server name. We're going to go ahead and connect the actual database instance that it's trying to create. So it's going to create a new database instance. We're going to click on Next. It's asking now for a service account for this particular server. Now, best practice requires that you have a dedicated system or service account. Now, here's the thing. Because we're going to be installing many components in order to create this Microsoft private cloud, we're going to be creating a lot of different things, Ops Manager, Service Manager, Orchestrate. There's going to be a lot of service accounts available for us to use. If I go out and start to adhere to these standards and create a different service accounts to each one, I'm going to confuse you, just because in your environment you might have different naming conventions, and for you to follow along with what I'm doing and which service account is associated with which is going to complicate your learning process. So what I'm going to do is break away from best practices at this point, but I don't want you to do that. In your environment, you should adhere to best practices. But for simplicity reasons, in our demo, in our examples, in our courses, I'm just going to use the administrator account to simplify things and so that you know what's where. And we're going to go ahead and put in the password. And down here you have the option of storing the encrypted keys for Virtual Machine Manager within Active Directory. Now, Active Directory is a highly available service, so it's a good idea to store the encryption keys within Active Directory. Makes it easier and better from a recovery standpoint, and it just creates that centralized repository for these encrypted keys. You know, if you're installing an agent on a Hyper-V host, that secret, that cache is saved within Active Directory. But before we can actually enable this, we have to go into Active Directory, we have to go on to our domain controller and make a few changes in order to prepare the infrastructure to accept the saving or the storing of these encrypted keys within Active Directory. So let's go ahead and switch over to our domain controller real quick. DCL1 domain controller.wiredbraincoffee.com is the name of the server that we're on. And yes, it is a Windows Server 2008 R2. This is the domain controller that I use for all of my courses for my Wired Brain Coffee domain, and I haven't upgraded that. It meets all the minimum requirements that I need for this particular course, so there's really no need for me to upgrade this server at this time. Now, the tool that we want to use here to create that infrastructure so that we can store these encrypted keys within Active Directory. In order to do that, we want to access a utility that you typically don't use on a regular basis, and that is kind of a scary utility that every book you've ever read and every class you've ever taken would tell you to avoid the use of the ADSI edit tool at all costs unless you absolutely have to. But in our case, we're actually going to use the ADSI edit. So if I click on it here, ADSI Edit allows you to essentially edit Active Directory directly on it. Like this is where you go. This is kind of like, think of it as command line for Active Directory. This is where you're hacking the directory itself by installing or creating objects within this directory. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that within Active Directory you can create objects, but you can't create certain fixed objects like containers. What we're going to do with ADSI Edit today is we're going to create a container. So the first thing I want to do is right click on it. We're going to click on Connect To. We can keep everything at default here. We're going to click on OK. That's going to bring up essentially what my domain looks like. Voila. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to simply right click. We're going to click on New, and we're going to click on Object. And within Object, we're going to select Container. We're going to click on Next. Now, for the value of the container, I want you to put in VMM DKM exactly as I am writing it on the screen. Capitalized, same way, exact same thing. Once you're ready, we're going to click on Next. I don't need to set any more attributes, so I'm just going to click on Finish. And voila, there is where it showed up. Now, there's one more thing that I want to do. I want to specify the right permissions on this particular container. So I'm going to right click on it, and we're going to drag down here to where it says Properties. And we're going to go to Security. And I want to make sure that Domain Admins has full control, which it does. I also want to go into Advanced. I want to click on Edit, and I want to make sure that it's applying to this object and all descendant objects as well. So I want to make sure this is configured properly. We're going to click on OK, and then we're going to click on OK again and OK to apply. Now, a few things that I want you to notice here. If you are not familiar with Active Directory or with the LDAP language in particular, you need to kind of familiarize yourself with what a distinguished name is. The distinguished name essentially is the actual path to this object in LDAP or in Active Directory. It's how it gets to that object, how it finds that object. Now, the syntax is very simple, but if you don't know it or if you can't figure it out for whatever reason, this is what we're going to need to essentially copy and paste into the other screen on the VMM server. Now, here's an easy way to copy and paste this. If you simply double click on it, it's going to expand it. Just right click on it here, drag down to where it says properties, and then you'll see that the distinguished name is up here. What I want you to do at this point, just click on view. You can do a quick Control C here. And then when we go to the other server, we should be able to paste this. So I'm going to click on cancel. We are done with this tool. So let's go ahead and switch back to our virtual machine manager server and continue the setup. And we're back. So after we've done that procedure, that process, now I can enable this, and let's go ahead and paste it in here real quick. This is the actual LDAP path to the container that we just created. This is the map of how to browse our Active Directory, our LDAP directory. This is how it's going to get to it. Once it's in here, we're going to go ahead and click on Next. You can feel free to change all the default ports if you choose to do so. For the purposes of our example, we're just going to stick with the default. Unless there is a security concern or anything of that matter, I would highly recommend that you keep them. And at this point, it's asking, where do you want to have your library share located? Now, the library within Virtual Machine Manager, and we're going to talk about it extensively, it's a repository for all the assets that you're going to use within your private cloud. These assets can be ISOs, they can be template, they can be services, they can be a whole slew of things that you're going to be using on, on a continuous basis. But you need a good centralized location to store them and be able to share them. So it's asking, well, where do you want to store them? Right now, the default path is this, and this is the share name with the description. I'm going to go ahead and change that, and we're going to put it on the E drive. I'm going to create a new directory, and let's call it VMM library. Voila. Now once we're ready, we're going to push forward. This is your summary screen. Bada bing, bada boom, and the installation is well on its way. Now, while the VMM management server and console are being installed on your server, this would be a good time for you to start installing the VMM console on your management PC. In my case, I have a Windows 7 64-bit with Service Pack 1 installed on it, where I'm going to install the management console in order for us to do all of our management from there. So this would be a good time while it's doing this to also be doing something at the same time. And there you go. So once the installation is complete, you can choose, to check for the latest Virtual Machine Manager updates if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that. If you want to go ahead and open the Virtual Machine Management Console again, I highly recommend that you do this off of a management PC, which is what we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this open, or actually let's go ahead and close it for now. But what I want to do is let's go ahead and switch over to our presentation. Let's talk about the hardware and software requirements for the installation of the console, and then launch the VMM console from that management PC. Alright, so from a console hardware requirements perspective, you're looking at an Intel Pentium 4 500 MHz processor. Is the minimum, 1 gig is recommended. I'd go higher. Most of your management PCs would probably be higher anyway. You're looking at about 512 meg of RAM minimum, 1 gig recommended. Again, I'm probably going with 4 gig on my management PC, probably more. 512 meg hard drive minimum, 2 gig recommended. Mine is going to have more than sufficient disk space. Now, do you notice that the 12 meg minimum and 2 gig recommended kind of is acceptable compared to, the other one for the server, which was 2 gig and 40 gig, I believe. So this is at least kind of close. So this is from a hardware requirements perspective. From a console software requirements, you want to make sure that your management PC is a member of the domain that you're in. You're gonna want Windows PowerShell 3.0. So make sure you find and download PowerShell 3.0. You're gonna need the Microsoft .NET Framework 4.0 or higher. From an operating systems perspective, Windows Server 2012 is obviously supported, Windows 8 is supported, Windows Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 or higher, Windows 7 Service Pack 1 or higher are the supported operating systems. Now, that being said, I've already installed the management console for VMM on my management PC. Let's go ahead and log on and see what it looks like. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and double click on this console. You want to point to the name of your server. You can do a fully qualified domain name, colon, you have your default port here. You can choose which credentials you want to log in with. Because I know that I'm logged into this current machine with credentials that are sufficient to run the console, I'm not changing them, but if you have a different username and password that you want to use, this would be a good time to do so. I'm going to click on Connect here. And would you take a look at that? Now this is a sexy console, isn't it? It's pretty cool. So what I've done ahead of time is I've already added Hyper-V 01 for a couple of reasons. First, for my sanity check, just to make sure I don't embarrass myself on national TV and that everything is working. We'll add 2 and 3 a little later on, but also to give you something to kind of look at. This is what the Virtual Machine Manager console looks like. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in this console. We're going to be digging in, out, up, down, left, and right. We're going to talk about all of its components. But what I want to do now is I want to give you a quick overview, a quick tour of, what's what and what am I looking at. So right now we have the Hyper-V 1 host selected. This is kind of an overview summary window of what's going on. The services and virtual machines that are running, the memory that's being used, the processor, you have the network, what the daily host performance looks like, what the monthly host performance looks like. All metrics that will help you as you're trying to manage this environment, becoming proactive. This is all good stuff. Now, you can also change the view here to one of VMs. Now, we don't have any VMs configured or installed yet, so we've got nothing to show. And then you can also change the view to services, and we're going to be spending a significant amount of time on services. But for those of you that are wondering what services are, and those of you that are familiar in the VMware world, in the vSphere world, services are not exactly, but very close to what a VApp is. So a service is a collection of virtual machines that kind of work towards the same purpose. So think of it as maybe an Exchange server that has, Exchange, maybe it has middleware, maybe it has, think about it as a Citrix server, a XenApp server, for instance, that requires a database server and a file server. It could be an ERP system. A collection of virtual machines, right? So you can have a web server, a middleware server, and a database server. This would become a service for X. So again, in the world of private cloud, in the world of cloud in general, the idea is that we're deploying services. We're no longer focusing on virtual machines, installing the operating system and the application. We're deploying the entire solution in the form of a service, and then we're managing it as a service. We take them down for maintenance as a service. So you have to get into that mindset. I promise I'll get into more details in later lessons, but I just want to give you a quick overview here. From a VM networking perspective, once we've got stuff configured, it'll show up in here as well. On the left, you have your, inventory tree here that, again, if you're looking at it, it's very cloud-like. So you have tenants, you have clouds, you have VM networks, you have storage, all the things that a big boy needs in order to create a cloud, right? So down here, if you click on Fabric, and Fabric is going to be the next lesson that we'll be talking about, we're going to be spending a lot of time on networking and storage. But what essentially the Fabric means is traditionally in just the regular enterprise data center, you would provision networks separately, independently, isolated, right? So you get a switch, you configure that switch, and you add capacity. You get a storage, you configure LUNs and carve it up, and you're doing it very independently, very impromptu. Maybe you're thinking a little ahead, but in a private cloud scenario, we are pre-provisioning, pre-configuring, creating rules and processes for automations and auto deployments so that we don't have to go through that manual process every time. We're creating a fabric where everything is pre-provisioned. We're pre-provisioning all the network, all the IP addresses, so that we can grab resources out of these pools without necessarily having to go through that manual process every time. So we'll spend a decent amount of time on the fabric and how to configure network and storage. And then down here you have your library. Library, again, like I said during the installation of VMM, this is where you're going to store all of the assets that you're going to use during the private cloud creation. Now that could be ISOs, services, templates, VMs, whatever you're going to use from an asset perspective. You can come into this central repository and grab it. So this is kind of an easy way of organizing all of your assets, and we're going to be using the library quite extensively, and we have a lesson dedicated to that as well. Jobs is really cool, right? So jobs is a way for you to track all the different changes, all of the different functions, tasks that have occurred on VMM, on your private cloud. This will also make your auditors' lives great because they're going to love it. So if I take a look here, let's see if I have anything in the history. So we have this job, which was the add virtual machine host, which is Hyper-V1, what I added to this virtual machine manager. You see the amount of detail that I have here, right? And this is still in the summary. So if I click on detail, it's giving you a step-by-step each PowerShell script, what it did, what step. Now, if you want to look at the change track, again, this is something that you can now export and give to your auditors that they would absolutely love. Look at the amount of details that are in here. So jobs are fantastic to track what's going on. It's also good for historical reasons, and you'll see as we do things with VMM, jobs are going to be a focal and central point of everything we do. Now down here where it says settings, this is where you're going to control all of the settings for your virtual machine manager server and your virtual machine manager environment in general. So on the left you have a bunch of nodes. We're going to start off with the general node. It has a couple of settings right now out of the box. Immediately the customer experience, if you want to change that, properties, and you can modify the settings if you want to. Everything's a right click. So database connection, again, properties, you're taking a look at how it's configured, where it's configured. This could be helpful for troubleshooting. The remote control console, this is the default port that you're connecting on. If you've changed that, you can come in here and take a look at what it is if you're trying to connect. From a library settings perspective, this is how often it's going to refresh the assets that are inside of your library. So again, you can change that if you choose to do so. The self-service administrative contact. So once we have a self-service environment and users start to have questions, technical issues, if you want to assign one user, maybe one group of users that get these email addresses, then you can come in here and specify the email address to which all of these requests are going to go to. The network settings, if you right click and you go to properties, again, because we're talking about clouds, right? Everything's automated, everything's orchestrated. VMM is again trying here to help in that automation process. This could be tricky. So what you're trying to do here with logical network matching is you're trying to figure out if there is a network match. If I have a virtual switch, for instance, this is just an example, that has X label in my virtual environment and the same label is matching, for example, in the physical environment, you are matching them, you are connecting them together, you are applying the same types of processes and procedures against them. This could be tricky. A lot of people will actually come in and disable that. Make sure you are aware of it, make sure you understand exactly the ramifications, and make sure that if you have issues, you know where to come back and kind of troubleshoot. For now, I'm going to leave all of these at defaults and just click on OK. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is the idea of security. So if you followed any of my courses, I'm a big believer in role-based access to everything. So everything needs to have roles. You can't just allow anyone to do anything, right? So VMM is the same thing. Your private cloud is the same thing. You can come in here and create role-based access to a whole slew of things. Now, before we talk about role-based access and go out and create one, I want to talk about create run as accounts. What are create run as accounts and why are they useful? So think about what we do in the regular world on a day-to-day basis as an administrator. Today, if I'm an administrator and I have other people in my organization that are helping me, but they don't have enough technical skills for me to give them administrative rights. But there are certain tasks that require administrative tasks that absolutely need an administrator's password. Now you can go out and customize usernames for them or user groups and roles exactly to those permissions that they need, but you're going to end up with a lot of users, a lot of specifications, a lot of detailed users that maybe it's too much, right? The run as accounts simplify things a little bit. So in the real world, if you have a junior administrator that says, hey, I need to add a machine to the domain, can you come in and put in your admin username and password? You got to go in there and do it. And every time you've assigned a task to them, if there's a prerequisite for something that you have to be involved in, well, there's a delay there because now you have to take time out of your day to go out and do it. Maybe you're not available, maybe you're out of the office, things could stop. The run as account is when you're pre-provisioning an account with all the right privileges that users can use to accomplish a specific task only. I'll give you an example. Let's go out and create this run as account, and this will become clearer in a second here. For now, I'm just going to call this run as account. I'm just going to give them my name. And we are going to do Wired Brain Coffee. And no, I am not crazy. Wired Brain Coffee, I know it requires 2 E, but it breaks the 15 character requirement, so I only can put 1 E. We're going to put Elias, and I'm going to put in my super secret Batman password. And we're going to click on OK here. So I've just created the first run as user account for my environment. And you'll see a little later on, as we're trying to do things and we're going to add Hyper-V hosts, instead of putting in your credentials, now you can use this run as account to service, to allow these connections, these tasks to take effect. Now, while we've done this, while we've added this new, service or security account, let's take a look at how we would create a user role. The user role is very similar. So if I'm going to click up here, and let's say I'm going to call this, I don't know, Fabric Admins. Click on Next. And you have several options to choose from when you're trying to do role-based access. Well, you can do Fabric Administrators, which means you're giving delegated administration for networking and storage and basically to be able to manage the fabric. You have read-only administrators. This could be your managers. This could be your auditors. Very self-explanatory. Tenant administrator. You have application administrator for self-service users. I mean, there's a lot of roles here that you can assign users for. For the purposes of this example, and we're not going to dig too deep into this, if you've ever used any of the Microsoft products, Citrix products, VMware products, this is essentially the same thing. You're creating a role, then you're associating it with a user or a group of users that they can have access to this role, and this role has a set of privileges. In this case, it's going to be Fabric Administrators. So let's go ahead and create this Fabric Administrator. The members of this Fabric Administrators, I'm going to make domain admins for now. And which object do you want to give them access on so that they can manage this? You can do this on all hosts. So I'm going to select all hosts. That's the only cluster. That's the only grouping of hosts that I have at this time. So I'm going to click on Next. But this is where you can get granular, right? This is where you can allow them maybe to have access over a Chicago container, over a Las Vegas container, and so on and so forth. You have the option of also assigning a library server so they can have access to these assets. So I'm going to go out and select the only library server that I have. If you want to allow them as part of this role to have access to certain run as accounts, and this is where you're customizing these run as accounts to these roles so that you're not giving them a username and password anymore, but you are pre-creating users that have access to accomplish specific tasks. So I'm going to use the existing user that we just created. And once you're done, you're going to click on Finish. You see this jobs again. This is really beautiful. It just comes up right away, and then you can select, again, what we created a run as account. Come up here. It's giving you all these options or these changes that are taking place that you can track. Jobs are just phenomenal. Once you're ready, we're going to click on Cancel here. Now, if we go into servicing windows is also very interesting. So what do we do? Again, you're going to find that all of the concepts that we're going to talk about throughout this course, they're not foreign to you. You do these on a regular basis. The cloud is not foreign to you. It's the same thing that we've been doing, but we're introducing a lot of automation, a lot of orchestration, a lot of self-servicing, so that us as IT administrators aren't focusing on the day-to-day stuff and focusing more on the applications, on the business, on how to improve, instead of on right-clicking and creating virtual machines. It gets boring after a while. So servicing windows, think of them as your outage windows, as your maintenance windows. What time of the day can you run maintenance on specific servers? What time of the week? What day of the week? What day of the month? This is where you can come in and specify your outage windows. Now to do that, we're going to click on Create Service here, and you have the option of giving it a name. What's the start time? What's the time zone? What's the end time? What's the duration? Again, you're specifying days, weeks, etc. Why is this helpful? Well, as you're creating a private cloud, and as you have these role-based access and these administrators that have specific capabilities, sometimes maybe you're giving access to your developers that want to install software. Maybe your Fabric administrators want to be able to make a change to storage and networking. Well, if you've specified the outage windows, if you've specified the servicing times, maybe it's Windows updates, when can they reboot, right? Then they can apply their automated tasks and say, okay, I want this automated task to happen during this servicing windows, and you're assigning it to the cloud, and the cloud as a result is saying, okay, well, I have this servicing windows, it's available on Mondays at 4 o'clock in the morning. I can apply it, and then automatically they're able to pick and choose servicing windows. Again, automation, orchestration, nothing foreign here. But this is very cool. Click on yes, we're not creating anything at this point. From a configuration provider's perspective, right now we have network load balancing by Microsoft. If you had other providers that are offering some of these plugins, this is where you would find them. You have your System Center settings in here. Right now, we don't have any integration, for instance, with Ops Manager or Service Manager or anything like that. As we progress with the course and we make that connection between Virtual Machine Manager and Ops Manager, we're going to come back in here and modify these settings. And then console add-ins. So console add-ins, think of them as plugins for your console. As you're adding more products on top of Virtual Machine Manager, like Ops Manager and Service Manager, any plugins that are required to kind of connect into that console, this is the location where you would do that. Now this was just a very quick general overview of this particular management console. What I want to do real quick is let's come back here and let's go ahead and add the 2 hosts that we have within our environment. Now to do that, I'm simply going to right click down here, and you'll find that you can add Hyper-V hosts, Citrix Xen Server hosts, you can add VMware ESX hosts. For now, we're just going to go through with Hyper-V. Now, another very cool thing with Hyper-V is you have a couple different options of how to add hosts. The one that we're going to use is the first one, which means your Hyper-V hosts are within the same domain. It's a trusted network, trusted Active Directory forest, whatever you want to call it. You can also add hosts from an untrusted Active Directory domain or forest by selecting this option and going through the process. We're not going to go through that. The one that I do want to bring your attention to, because I think it's very cool, is Windows Server computers in a perimeter network. This is cool because now I can manage Hyper-V hosts that are in a DMZ without necessarily having to go through firewall rules and port opens and ACLs and all the complications that existed using traditional TCP, SMB type, UNC type approaches to this type of connectivity, right? So because Microsoft is moving more towards Windows RM, WinRM, and Windows Remote Management, you have the capabilities, if you select this option here and click on Next, of using a very simple security method that we've been using for a long time, which is something that you know and something that you don't know, kind of a public-private key scenario. So as you're installing those Hyper-V hosts, in the perimeter network, they have maybe the public key and a private key, and then you have something to authenticate against here, and you're configuring those. You can give or manage your Hyper-V hosts that are in a DMZ from within VMM without having to go through a lot of hooplas that you did in the past. From a physical computer's perspective, this is where you can kind of auto-deploy your Hyper-V host to bare metal. These very self-explanatory here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the first option. Click on Next. This is cool, right? So this is where you can either assign the credentials that you want to use to authenticate and add these Hyper-V hosts to Virtual Machine Manager. Or if I'm a junior administrator and my manager has asked me to do this, I don't need to ask him for anything anymore because I know that he's created a Run As account for me. So I'm going to click on Browse. I'm going to select that Run As account, and I'm going to click on OK. Now, look how simple this is, but look how quickly I was able to get past this step. I don't have to wait for someone to give me the service account password or the username. I don't have to email anyone, call anyone, nothing. I'm done. Next. And at this point, you can either specify the Windows Server computers by name, or you can go by Active Directory. We're just going to do name, so I'm going to do Hyper-V 02, and on another line I'm going to do Hyper-V 03 here. Click on Next. It automatically finds them. We're going to select both of them, and then we're going to click on Next. Now it's asking you where do you want to place them. Right now I don't have a cluster. This is the only host group that I have, so I'm just going to dump them in the old hosts. This is important. You want to click this option here to make sure you're reassociating these hosts that you're adding to VMM with this particular virtual machine manager management server. So just in case they were being managed by something else, by another VMM server, whatever the case is, by selecting this checkbox, you are again taking control of these hosts and associating them with this server. So make sure you check that. I'm going to click on Next here, and when you're ready, we're going to click on Finish. You can see it already added them in the console. The jobs is just phenomenal. I mean, if you take a look at jobs here, and we double click on this one, for example, which is, I mean, the level of details that it's giving you is just, it's great. And the amount of tracking that you can do, I mean, look at this report. This is beautiful. This is a great way of getting someone off your back very quickly. So this is what I had from a tour perspective. This is kind of what I wanted to show you. So let's go back to our virtual machine manager management server now real quick. And let's talk about one more thing before we end this very, very cool lesson. And that is the VMM Configuration Analyzer. So the VMM Configuration Analyzer is a set of rules, set of best practices that Microsoft puts forth, where you can install and then compare those best practices against your environment to see, well, essentially how you stack up against Microsoft's best practices. Now, in order for you to download and run the VMM Configuration Analyzer, you can click on this link here. It'll take you or redirect you to a web page that will allow you to download the version that corresponds to the operating system that you have. For example, I downloaded the 64-bit. Now, before you do that, before you can install the set of rules, you need an engine in order to display these rules. So you're going to need the Microsoft Baseline Configuration Analyzer 2.0. In order to install. So you install that first, and then you install the VMM specific configuration analyzer on top of that, which will give you access to these rules. Now, why did Microsoft do that? Microsoft has a lot of products. Instead of having, a separate install for each one, they are creating that framework, that infrastructure, and then as you add more products, all you have to do is essentially install the rules, the best practices for these products to measure yourself or your environment against Microsoft best practices. So what I've done is I've already downloaded these executables. So let's go ahead and exit out of here, and let's also get out of here and close this. I'm going to double click. Let's go to Downloads in this folder, and let's start by installing first the Microsoft Baseline Configuration Analyzer 2.0. Very, very simple installation. I'm just going to accept all the defaults. This is the default path where it's going to put the installation files. Once that's completed, then you can install the VMM Configuration Analyzer. Again, accept the EULA. Very, very straightforward installation. And click on Finish. Now, one final thing that you have to do before you can run this is you have to set the execution policy on your PowerShell to remote signed. In order to do that, let's go to the Start menu, Run Windows PowerShell, and I want you to apply the following command. Now, for me, it's probably going to give me an error because I've already run this. Once you run this, well, there you go. I have to click on Yes in order for me to essentially allow remote signed execution of scripts. So once that is set, we are now ready to launch the Microsoft Baseline Configuration Analyzer. Again, we're going to go to the Start menu here real quick, and there it is. Once this loads from the drop-down menu, you'll see that my Virtual Machine Manager Configuration Analyzer is loaded. So I'm going to select that, click on Start Scan, and you have an option to enter or specify parameters. So if you want to essentially figure out which patches Microsoft recommends that you apply against your Virtual Machine Manager environment, you can select this checkbox. It's going to download the recent patches. It's not going to download the patches themselves, but it's going to download which patches are required updates for your environment. If you just want to analyze your virtual machine environment against Microsoft best practices, which is what we're going to do, you can select enabled, put in the name of the server that you are trying to run this configuration analyzer against. If you wanted to analyze individual servers, you can always select enabled here and then click on or put in the name of the servers that you're trying to analyze. So once you have all of that configured and ready to go, we're going to click on Start the Scan in order to begin the scan. And we have an error. We were greeted with an error. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this is. So what we have here is actually a bug. And hopefully by the time you're viewing this, Microsoft would have addressed this. Now I've tried to execute this particular command in PowerShell just to see if it's broken from a GUI perspective or if it's broken, essentially broken. And from the GUI I can execute this and I can get the parameters for the server just fine. So this is most definitely a bug that you see here with the baseline configuration analyzer for VMM. Now, one way to get around it, let me show you. If we go back all the way up here to enter parameters, and instead of putting in VMM01 up here, if we delete it from here and just put it in down here and put in VMM01 and then click on Start Scan Now, you'll find that this time it'll go through and it will give you actual parameters that you can work with. Let's go ahead and try that. So if I expand the error node here, you'll find that I have two errors already. One of them has to do with the service provider principal names, or the service principal names here, that have not registered properly, and it's giving you the way to resolve this from a registration perspective and what you need to do, which is really cool because it's also giving you the solution of what to do. I strongly recommend, and I'm going to do that also, that you pause the video, make sure you're addressing all of these concerns here. Now the second issue that I am getting that you might not get in your environment is that it's reporting that the WinRM service is present, but it's not using the version 2.0. Now because we're using VMM SP1, I believe that the configuration analyzer for VMM has not been updated yet, because if you follow these commands here, and you'll find that the stack equals 3 for us, which means we have a higher version than what the analyzer is expecting to find, which means that this hasn't been updated as of yet. Now if we want to take a look at all of these reports to figure out, well, okay, these are my errors, do I have anything that's compliant, I want you to click on all here and you'll find that it brings you another node that says compliant, and then that gives you, some of the stuff where with green checkboxes what you've actually done correctly. You can obviously filter this, you can arrange it, you can take a look at exclusions, you can look at all of the collected data. So again, it gives you a lot of granularity, and it's very cool because it allows you to measure your environment again against Microsoft best practices. Now once you're done with that, you can save the report, export the report, run this again if you choose to do so. For our purposes, we're just going to exit out of here. And this brings us to the end of this lesson, folks. This wasn't an overly complicated lesson, but it was really cool. It's a good foundation lesson. Allowed us to kind of, install VMM. We went through the tour of the VMM console, where different things are, so that, we just get a little familiar, so that as we're going through the other lessons, we're kind of familiar with what's going on. We added Hyper-V 1, 2, and 3 to the VMM management server. We installed the console on a different management PC and we ran the console from there. So we accomplished a lot. We laid out a good framework. We've also installed the Microsoft Baseline Configuration Analyzer. We installed the VMM Configuration Analyzer. We ran some configs to figure out how our environment measures against Microsoft best practices. Finally, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.